Jesus says that he and the Father, they will give to you another helper to be with you forever, and that he dwells with you and in you. Now, a few things here. One, if you were reading this in an actual physical Bible instead of the words on the screen, you probably see a little footnote. Mine's the number 6, and you look down to the bottom of the page, and it'll say something like helper or advocate, counselor, or comforter. Now, the reason for that, we know that he's talking about the Holy Spirit because he makes that really clear here in verse 26. He says the same word in my translation, helper, and then has that again. It says the helper who is the Holy Spirit. Now, the reason you got that footnote is because the Greek word behind helper there is the word parakletos. And there's just not an English word that we had that fully encapsulates all of what this word means. And so various English translations, they do different things with it. Now, so first off, it's partly this word, it's partly like a courtroom word. Like that's what the translation advocate or counselor kind of gets at. It's kind of this inner lawyer inside you that defends you against feeling alone and unloved. The Holy Spirit as an advocate or counselor tells us that God is with us and that he's with you and that he loves you no matter what, permanently, forever. And he defends every single lie of the enemy that would tell you otherwise. The Holy Spirit loves you and is with you. He's an advocate or a counselor, a lawyer for your soul in that way. Now, it's that, but it's also partly a friendship or family word, which is what the translation comforter kind of gets more at. The indwelling of God, it tells you that you're not an orphan. What Jesus says here, he's not going to leave you an orphan. We're not orphans, but we are in the family of God as his special sons and daughters. Jesus came so that we could be adopted into his divine family. We're not orphans, man. We belong to the family of God. And the Spirit tells us that. Spirit tells us. Now, Jesus makes clear here, and I think this is maybe what we miss most often. A lot of people miss when we talk about the Holy Spirit. Jesus makes it very, very clear here in this passage that this Spirit, the Holy Spirit, it's his Spirit. It is the Spirit of Jesus himself. The Holy Spirit is the Spirit of Jesus. So, you got to kind of like imagine the scene. Jesus is standing right there in front of the disciples. And we read from the beginning of chapter in chapter 14. He says he's going to be going away soon, going back to the Father. But he makes clear that even though he will no longer physically be present with them in the flesh, in his body, that he will still, in a very real and a very tangible way, he will still be with them by his Spirit. This speaks to the very unique and special experience that Christians have called the witness of the Spirit. The witness of the Spirit. It's where we experientially, in our subjective, personal thoughts and feelings, where we sense this very real presence of God with us and in us. Now, in our day and age, this can be kind of tricky, though. How do you know that what you sense and feel is really the Spirit of God? And it's not just you being like over emotional and kind of reading into your feelings or whatever and just saying, oh, like what I'm feeling is God. How do you know whether the Spirit that you sense and feel is actually the Holy Spirit? That's a very, very good question. That's a good question to ask. For several other religions, its test or for truth or authenticity is what you feel. So if you feel like it's right for you, then it is. Truth is what you feel and what you like most. But what Jesus is here is saying something different, something more. The disciples, remember, spent 3 years with Jesus, living with him. They're talking with him. They're eating with him. They're watching him. They're listening to him. They knew Jesus very, very well. They're taking in his presence. They knew his Spirit. They knew the Spirit of Jesus. Jesus was telling his original 12 disciples here that when he sent them his Spirit after he was gone, that they would immediately recognize that it was his Spirit. They would know it was the Spirit of Jesus. In part, That's what Jesus is getting at in verse 26 when he says that the Spirit would bring to remembrance all that he had said. The Spirit would speak the same truths directly to their hearts that they heard Jesus speak with his mouth. So the presence of the Spirit, it would feel and sound the same way. And that's exactly what happened. Peter, one of Jesus' original 12 disciples, years later ends up writing his own book about Jesus in the first chapter. In verse 8, he says, though you have not seen him, Jesus, you love him. And though you do not now see him, you believe in him, and you rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory. Even though you've never seen him, you know him and you believe in him. D.A. Carson is one of my favorite living theologians and scholars. He says this: the world is suspicious of what it cannot see. But seeing in itself guarantees nothing, as the world's response to Jesus in his own day demonstrates. The only person who will truly understand the words about the Spirit is the one who has already experienced the presence of the Spirit. Another guy, John Calvin, who's one of my favorite dead theologians and scholars, we got a living one and a dead one today, he says it this way: though absent from body, Jesus is present by his Spirit, and nothing which relates to the Holy Spirit can be learned by human reason. He's only known by the experience of faith. What these two guys are saying is that the way that we know, the way we know and the experience or the feeling or the subjective awareness of the presence of God, the way that we know that is actually the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit with us and in us, same way that the disciples did. The same way. It's through the words and the presence of Jesus. And that's one of the big reasons that God made sure that the words of Jesus were written and recorded for all time. 4 different books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the Bible for us today, so that we could get to know the words and the presence of Jesus. The Spirit of God sounds like the Jesus we read of in the Bible. He says the same things directly to our hearts that we read on the page. The Spirit of God, it feels like the Jesus that we feel and we sense when we read it in the Bible. He imparts that same presence to our hearts that we feel when we read the book. And this is incredible. It's why Jesus says a couple chapters later in John 16, verse 7, he says, it's to your advantage that I go away, because if I don't go away, the helper's not going to come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. The reason it's better, or to our advantage, that of Jesus going away and returning to the Father and then sending the Spirit, is that then his Spirit can be really and truly present with people everywhere, wherever they are. Not just with one small group of people in one geographical location over in the Middle East. That's incredible. That the same Spirit of God that lives in me lives in you and you and you and people all over our city and all of our state and all of our country and all over the world. The Spirit of God dwelling in those who have believed in Jesus and received his Spirit. That's an incredible thing that God accomplishes for us. When we believe in Jesus, he makes our hearts his home.